So just to present myself, I am Rasha. I now work in public relations for the International Association for Political Science Students. I just finished my undergrad in political science in McGill. And yes, now I work in communication. I write, I do photography also on the side. So to introduce you, you are currently a professor in Indigenous politics at Brock University. You focus mainly, your work focuses on settler colonialism, coloniality, Indigenous-settler relationships, critical approaches to international politics, and decolonial political and international thought. For today, my questions would mainly focus on a recent report led by an international team of authors for Columbia University, calling for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples' knowledge in climate policy and how this event explores the role of Indigenous traditions and the colonial approach and how they can have they can impact policymaking at the national and international level. So my first question would be around the report. There are three types of knowledge systems observed in the report: Indigenous, local, and scientific. It's the main ones they talk about. I see it as an opportunity for us to decolonize our mindset towards science as the universal knowledge system and stop seeing local and Indigenous knowledge as systems that are outdated, static, inaccurate. So how do you see them interacting together despite their duality, and how can policy making help smooth out the process, in your opinion?
Oh, you're starting me off hard, aren't you? I want to say first, though, Rasha, it's great to be here with you, and thank you so much. Your introduction was absolutely correct, and the only thing I would add is that I'm a settler scholar at Brock University. So while I look at like Indigenous governance and Indigenous politics, and I do a lot of that teaching too, I want to kind of make sure that everybody watching understands. Like I'm speaking for myself as a settler scholar here, and I don't want to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples or certainly like any particular nation. But I think, yeah, like you said, the report does a really good job of outlining three different ways of understanding the world and kind of categorizing them in these knowledge systems. One of the things that we've really seen in the last few hundred years, especially, is a rise of that kind of scientific paradigm, and that what Bentley Allen calls a scientific cosmology, especially within international relations. But we see it in terms of policy making all around the world, where a sort of Western scientific positivist view, essentially, when we start thinking about social sciences, really does carry the day in terms of the power and the legitimacy that it holds. And so what we get is that has colonial impacts, not only insofar as, I mean, the report does a good job of talking about the way that it has been a part of the colonial project since its inception. It certainly kind of remains, and some of what I look at is the way that it remains part of the settler colonial project, looking at Canada, but also if you look outside of Canada at other settler spaces like Argentina, like other places in South America, like other places in the Anglo world, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And so I think in terms of the relationship between these kind of Indigenous, local, and scientific sets of knowledges, there's a lot that we've seen that Western science kind of takes from Indigenous and local knowledges, really. We're getting to the point now where it's being reported on the ways that kind of Indigenous knowledges are leading to scientific breakthroughs is the way that it gets talked about. But that still positions science as the kind of default or the most legitimate, certainly the most authoritative. And one of the things that we really need to be careful with there is understanding the foundational role that Indigenous knowledges and local knowledges, which I found really useful to think about as well, really play in building scientific concepts, scientific ideas, and really expanding what science tells us about the world. If the way that we think about these knowledge systems is kind of really trying to each being a different way of understanding the world and having knowledge about the world and building our understanding of it, then each of them understand the world quite differently. When I think about Indigenous knowledge systems, they're very relational. The ontology is one in which like we don't exist apart from the world. We don't see a world outside of ourselves, where we're part of that natural world. that doesn't accord well with the sort of scientific neutral observer position that we need to try our best to take. And of course, that's imperfect, and science is always striving for that, even if it itself recognizes it's not going to meet that. But I think just on the level of how they understand the world, we need to start moving away from a sort of default anti-bias neutrality as what we should expect from ways of understanding the world. And that's one thing that I think Indigenous and even local knowledges teaches us. Like we're implicated in this. And when it comes to climate change and the effects of climate change and what kinds of solutions are available, both Indigenous and local knowledges have quite a bit more to tell us than science in some ways, both in terms of understanding the impacts of climate change. But I think one of the things that the report really did well was point out that it also has a lot to tell us when we start thinking about how to move past climate, or how to address climate change, what kinds of steps we can be taking. And so there needs to be a bit more attention to each of these ways of knowing, but especially the knowledge that the Indigenous peoples have developed over the course of centuries and generations.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to a specific point that you talked about at some point, which is that in science, in a lot of scientific breakthrough, we used a lot of Indigenous traditions and information. I'm assuming the credit wasn't given, it was just taken, right, when this happened? Like,
sorry, I just lost you for a second there.
Oh yes.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So sorry about that. You talked at some
no, that's my fault.
How in a lot of scientific breakthrough we used information from Indigenous traditions. I'm assuming that credit was taken from them when this happened. Like scientists didn't actually talk about the source of their information. Is this the case? How did it happen in general?
Yeah, it's hard to know. One thing that is really interesting in the report, and that we see kind of outside of the report as well, is that scientists themselves will kind of find ways of making clear where they got information, right? Like, I don't think that this is necessarily a problem with individual scientists, although certainly scientists themselves are part of that system. And so you'll get kind of mentions of that they learned about, be it a plant or an animal's behavior from a different community. Or one of the things the report talks about is the way that slaves were used in the development of science and were used as workers, as scientific workers, and as people that were sent out to observe and report on. So they were fundamentally part of this process. And so in some cases you get some credit, or at least some acknowledgement of who did a lot of the work, or kind of who passed on information. But the way that, especially now, we start to learn about that is that once it gets put into intellectual property regimes, once it gets written up into scientific papers, once it gets reported on in the media, that all gets taken away, and it becomes a sort of, these researchers made these findings. Or I think especially about, so in Canada, we had the Franklin expedition to look for some ships that had been abandoned off of Nunavut, off the coast. And we went in, but a research team went in and tried to find them. And they found them exactly where Inuit had said they would be. And yet it gets reported as these scientists or these discoverers going out and making this discovery, right? And so that all gets lost when we start really reporting on it and framing it as this kind of individualized endeavor. And so I think, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of whether or not it's clear who made the discoveries or who, provided the knowledge, but certainly in the retelling of it. And when we start to get to intellectual property and kind of questions of ownership, especially, then we get to a place where Indigenous peoples and local, other, what they're called subaltern peoples within the report, like they don't end up being the owners, they don't get the credit. And I think that then does a disservice to the way that they have pushed science and our own understanding of the world further.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So my next question is that Indigenous knowledge systems add a moral and sustainable approach, value and interconnectedness, and despite their cultural diversity, represent a common systemic way of thinking and viewing the world, to work for climate change in a more sustainable and decolonizing way. So how do you think its inclusion to climate policy will affect Indigenous-settler relationships? Will it help them obtain sovereignty the way they want to? Is there a risk of indigenous knowledge only being instrumentalized at the expense of these communities that will be kept in the dark, or will it help in their societal integration or to heighten their voice? What do you think?
Rasha, you've hit on one of the key things that I really took and was thinking about after reading the report and kind of thinking about this long term, and even one of the things I've heard from my own research subjects,
I'm glad to
both
hear
in
that.
terms of, yeah, no, it's true, because what we oftentimes get, and I mean, Canada itself and a lot of other kind of OECD countries around the world, and it's something you see with UNESCO, and like there's this real push to include Indigenous voices and to recognize Indigenous knowledge as legitimate knowledge on the level of Western science. And I don't want to say that that's the wrong-headed approach, because it's not, right? Like, we know that Indigenous peoples know quite a bit more about their environments and their territories than, settlers who will come in. But the problem with inclusion is it doesn't necessarily shift relationships of power. And, I was trained in political science, and that's at the core of the way that I like to think about these things is, okay, if we're including Indigenous knowledge, on whose terms are we really including it? And quite frankly, if we're including local knowledge, it's the same question: whose terms, and how does that end up being shaped in these policy frameworks and in decision making? It is wonderful to include Indigenous knowledge, but it doesn't look like Western scientific knowledge. It doesn't give you exactly the same kind of data output that a lot of times policymakers at least like to say that they want to rely on, and certainly that science, uses in a lot of its own kind of analysis and decision making. And so, yeah, I think the risk really is that if we just say we want to include Indigenous voices, or we want to build new processes, like I noted, COP26, what we ended up seeing was, calls for greater inclusion and different opportunities. And I don't want to dissuade anybody from pushing for greater inclusion, but at the same time, there isn't a whole lot in the report that I saw that was talking about questions of sovereignty. The case study, the second one that they had with the Mapuche, made really clear that one of the things that was most successful was giving power, authority, jurisdiction, ruling authority back to the Mapuche. And so if that was what was really effective, then that is something that we really need to look at around the rest of the world, right? Like, we can't allow Indigenous knowledge to just be used in an instrumental way, because without actual decision-making power, and without there being a real and meaningful inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in decision-making processes, we're not going to get the kind of change that we expect to be able to see. And, that can then put into place a kind of cycle where we get politicians saying, well, we're not really learning from Indigenous peoples. And that then you go back to this Western scientific knowledge or technology and technological innovation is the only way out of a climate catastrophe. And that is also dangerous, because that repeats those colonial patterns. It continues to be extractive without, giving power and authority back to Indigenous communities if we don't do that. And so I think, yeah, like that is one of my real concerns whenever this sort of broad inclusivity framing is brought up, is like, look, we need to be really clear about how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and who ends up getting the power, because state governments haven't really shown themselves willing to hand over authority. And so if they're not going to do it, then that tells you what they really think about how they really value Indigenous knowledge, I guess.
Thank you. This is actually linked to one of the questions I wanted to ask about sharing authority, because we see that an obstacle we can think about is the fact that this report would require westernized international systems to collaborate and share sovereignty and authority, like you said, with Indigenous people and local people, it can be beneficial for both parties, but how can they be convinced of doing so and sharing this power that they have? Because I would assume that Western powers now are happy with the current status quo. So
it's hard to know if they will, or it's hard to know if they are happy with the status quo, right? Like, we certainly don't see a lot of moves to suggest they're really interested in facing the potential catastrophe that I think we all agree is coming, and certainly the science would say is coming, does say is coming. Both indigenous knowledge and Western science says this is not going to end well. And we can see the changes already, right? I think one of the most effective thing, or I should say, one of the real ways that indigenous peoples have been effective at pushing for sovereignty, pushing for greater inclusion, and making that meaningful has been through international organizing. We can think of their inclusion in conventions on biodiversity. We can think of the passage of and the development of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Like, those aren't themselves panaceas. They aren't themselves going to change the world, but they offer a series of tools and opportunities for indigenous peoples to keep developing not only their own capacity, but then kind of pushing and requiring their say in decision making. Mm-hmm. And so in some respects, it might not end up being up to governments. They might be outmaneuvered again, like we've seen time and time again. We might see, for example, in Canada, we have courts that have said that, companies' development and government's approval of development projects, sort of oil and gas especially, and the effects of that runs counter to Indigenous rights and Indigenous authority and title. And so it might not end up being up to states in the end if courts are really going to be able to step in and if there's actual follow through on that. How states end up being convinced, I think, is a difficult question. Forcing them into these kinds of policy processes that are raised in the report, that can be one effective way, a kind of requiring of Indigenous voices to be included. But I think a lot of where the successes have come is Indigenous peoples showing and doing politics better than state governments have been. It's Indigenous peoples being really effective at creating new messages and creating the kinds of conditions on the ground that states have to face, be that on the ground in terms of stopping development projects or blockading roads, be it facts on the ground in terms of a kind of discursive terrain and winning the kind of discourse battle in that regard, and the rhetorical battle, and convincing the state citizens and others around the world that like this has to happen, or at least those in positions of power. But I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a sort of power play, and it's going to take a sort of shifting of the conditions under the feet of states. And that might end up happening. Companies around the world aren't too thrilled at having potential economic development projects blocked repeatedly for a long time. And so they're going to start pushing governments that, there has to be another way. And so I think that there are ways, but I don't think it is going to come out of the benevolence of states or governments. I think it's really going to be a situation where, they end up getting put in a position where they can't say no, so to speak, and where they're kind of forced to act. And I think that's probably where we're going to see the most effective opposition coming from.
And where would this pressure come from? Do you think it comes more from society and activists, NGOs?
I think it's a combination of that, right? One of the things that we have really seen is a coordinated effort between NGOs, international organizing, and kind of getting into the halls of power. That connected with sort of on the ground resistance has been really effective. And especially when there is connection and kind of shared messaging and shared concepts and arguments between the two. I think that has been really powerful. And I think that on the ground kind of organizing is necessary and required, because you're not going to get it with a sort of moral persuasion alone. That has to be backed up with something. And that's what we've seen time and time again. But yeah, I'm not sure. It's hard to see, because you also need decision makers and policy professionals or NGO directors or like other settlers to be convinced and to join that as well. And so I think it's Indigenous peoples, kind of more local groups, but allies in positions to make a real change. That connection is going to be really important too.
And how much do you think the UN has been helpful on this topic? Do you think they've been helping a lot, or Are they more?
I think
Where
it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. The UN certainly has been ahead of a lot of countries in the world in terms of inclusivity, in terms of um, being able to act. It's also, I think, one of the greatest impacts of the United Nations and its various bodies and organizations within it has really been as a platform. And I think, Indigenous peoples have been able to use the UN, been able to use the various different bodies within it, the conventions within it, use the sort of rhetoric of international rights and kind of international law that the UN really takes seriously and embodies. They've been able to use it both as a way to kind of develop their own capacity, their own knowledge, and also to increasingly have their issues be heard. And so I think that's something that we're seeing again with the sort of inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in climate change, attempts to tackle climate change, because that wouldn't happen without Indigenous people standing up and saying, hey, guess what? We know better than you, or here's where this comes from. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag because the UN itself isn't going to be forcing countries to do anything, but it does offer a platform for Indigenous peoples, and it can be an effective tool in that kind of moral suasion play, just as long as it's not the only tool. I think that it can be effective. It's not going to be the be all and end all, I guess.
So it's really the logic of getting into the system in order to change it.
That can work, yeah. I think it works most effectively when it's also backed up with people outside of that system kind of changing the conditions that the system exists within. And so that's the kind of on the ground organizing and whatnot. And, and quite frankly, building capacity outside of these kind of official policy systems, and official policy areas. Like I think of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. That's a big thing in Canada now and becoming increasingly prominent. And it started out of a government framework. It started out of a sort of framework for the government to jointly work with Indigenous nations to put in place these conservation areas to meet its obligations under the Convention on Biodiversity. And from there, Indigenous communities took it and ran. Like we see a number of them now popping up where they're being declared by Indigenous communities without government as partners. And so we're really seeing those kind of on the ground changes in a way that, the government put in place a system, they put in place a set of processes, and, they were used by Indigenous peoples for their own ends, both to kind of reclaim sovereignty and to, push forward with their sort of working through their own knowledge systems. And I think that that has been really effective in many ways. And so, yeah, I think, the UN's, it can be effective, but it also means that it's opening space for Indigenous peoples to really open the door even further.
Depends on how it's approached.
Exactly, yeah.
So taking into consideration colonialist history and its influence on climate change, it can be an opportunity for the global recognition and respect of the Indigenous cause. In fact, they're part of the most vulnerable and touched communities facing climate change due to their intimate relationship to their land and usually high levels of poverty and bad living conditions, which is leading to their common displacement or loss of resources. A good level of historical information starts with an accurate education. So how do you think this can be effectively implemented?
Like Indigenous knowledge?
Yes, and education on the topic.
Honestly, I think if we're thinking about kind of implementing activities that are underpinned by Indigenous knowledge, that comes from communities themselves, and that comes from communities asserting their jurisdiction and their sovereignty. And that's what we've seen time and time again. And that's what we kind of see as being most effective. When we start talking about education, there's been a lot of talk about, everybody needs to go out and read more or learn more. The information's out there. And I think that's fair, but part of that is a media problem too. If we're not getting the kinds of media stories, if we're not if the media news, especially, I think, isn't readily accessible and easy for people to understand the value of Indigenous knowledge, then that gets lost. Everybody's busy and everybody has a lot going on every day, and not everybody spends their days thinking about climate change. And so, on a kind of public societal level, I think that those stories need to be focused on, and the value of Indigenous knowledge really needs to be made central. But there's also education in terms of making clear to policymakers and those in positions of power kind of why this is important. And that's where I think Indigenous peoples have been especially effective at getting in the room to places like climate change negotiations, like the conventions of parties, or kind of getting involved in other conventions, be it on biodiversity or whatever else. Like, those are really effective spaces to be in, and really can be helpful in convincing decision makers, but also the scientists that are doing the work that really shows what the impacts are and offer solutions. Showing those people the value of Indigenous knowledge and having Indigenous peoples involved in those processes can also be really effective. And I think that's one of the things that we're starting to see as we move forward, is that cracking of the door open. Indigenous peoples are able to come in and make clear what they know, and how, in some cases, in a lot of cases, they may know better than scientists themselves in many respects. They have a different baseline. The worry then is a sort of making sure that Indigenous knowledge isn't needed to shift too much or change too much to resemble science to be heard. But that's something that Indigenous peoples negotiate all the time when they're kind of engaging with states or the international system to be able to be heard. And so figuring out how to make that work and pushing the boundaries of what kinds of frameworks exist, I think is something that Indigenous organizing has done really well. And we're still seeing the kind of push and the effectiveness in some ways of that push to be included.
Yeah. It's difficult because there's this sort of vicious circle that, like, you need more education in order to get more voice and change some policies, but also you need to change some policies to get this education to get better and more accurate. So it's complicated.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I think that we've seen in Indigenous organizing, but also a lot of other organizing as well. Like, I think of the Black Power movement in the United States. One of the real pushes was to set up a school system. And one of the real imperatives of a lot of kind of communities who are formerly colonized or still marginalized has been to push and really succeed in articulating their needs, in part through a sort of education first approach. And I think that's been really effective. And then that allows them to be in those rooms and be able to, if not speak the same language as those who are making decisions, at least be able to put those people making decisions in a position where they have to acknowledge the expertise on the other side of the table. And I think that's been a real win. That's been really effective. And so, yeah, that piece of education is really important, and honestly, something that we probably don't give enough credit to.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Thank you so much, Professor. So it leads me to my last question to wrap up. Is that this report seems great in theory, but is it realistically feasible? And how do you think its evolution is going so far? Are we on a good path? And how do you think the evolution of the whole cause is going? Also, the whole cause of indigeneity being more included in climate change policy and international policy in general.
Not a small question to end off, eh? No, but I think it's hard to know. I think, is it more visible? Is Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous voices, Indigenous peoples themselves at these kinds of conferences more visible and more present? Yeah. And I think that has a number of benefits and can be used in quite an effective way. I think the key, and we're certainly not there yet, and I think it's maybe something that we can evaluate the integration and inclusion of Indigenous knowledge on this, is whether or not Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples are going to have the kind of power and authority jurisdiction, the sovereignty, however we want to frame it, to make their own decisions and to start implementing some of these, some initiatives based on their own knowledges. Because I think you're right, like it is great to see the processes in place, or the theoretical processes in place. It's really important. But I think we're kind of, I don't want to say at the starting point because it's been years, but we're at a point at which we can start to really look and really evaluate success based on whether or not just whether or not our climate is, like our actions are starting to meet the actual challenge, but I think whether or not Indigenous sovereignty is foregrounded, and whether or not Indigenous jurisdiction is foregrounded, and whether or not these communities can build capacity, build capability through this sort of decolonial processes, and decolonial in terms of having some authority and having some say in the matter. And I don't have a clear answer on whether or not on an evaluation of that right now, but I think any evaluation needs to start from that question of power and who is wielding it and who gets to make some of these decisions. And so if we start seeing that change, and as we start seeing some of these initiatives and actions really shifting the way that business is conducted, the way that states make decisions, the way that these conventions are written, then I think that's when we'll be able to say, like, all right, we're on the correct path. So I'm hopeful, kind of need to be hopeful if we're gonna look forward to a good future together. But I do think that this is one of the ways that we're really going to see things change.
I'm really hopeful you're right. Really, it's the only
that makes two of us.
Yes. And yes, I think that was it for my questions. So thank you so much for the time you gave us. It was a very interesting discussion. I think it's a very important topic to discuss right now. So
I agree.
Specifically with the Convention on Biodiversity, I know COP15 is approaching, so it would make even more sense to talk about it now.
Absolutely. So. No, it was great. I really, really appreciate the invitation and the chance that I had to talk to you, the time that you took to talk to me. So, Rasha, this was great. And the questions they made me think a lot. So you did a great job.
That's great. I'm glad it did.